Okay. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Get Paid, the profitable advantage of inclusive diversity. And so I know you're looking at the screen and you're like, oh, that's different. It is. Unfortunately, my co-host, Deborah Swartzfarb, had a family emergency and she couldn't be here this morning. But we had to make sure the show went on. And so I reached out to two of my favorite professionals in human resources. One is Tara Favors, and Tara is the Vice President of HR for Global Merchant Services and Network Services. I always forget network services. I get merchant because I've been one for so long, but I forget network services for American Express. And Jessica Simpson is the CEO and founder of the 10K Collective. So I just want to welcome you two and thank you so much for the last minute. I reached out to them literally the last minute, so I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you for your time and for your friendship. So today we're talking about how to have difficult or hot topic conversations in the workplace. It's timely subject. This week, everyone has been abuzz, obviously, with what's going on with what went on with the Chauvin trial verdict, George Floyd, Ma'Khia Bryant in Columbus, Ohio, just in general, the ongoing discussions around gender parity, racism, who's in the boardroom, who's outside, the political climate. So there's a lot of hot topics that you could pick from. But I often get asked, and I'm going to ask my professionals how to handle this or if they run into this situation. But in my professional role, I often get asked, is there a line that you should draw on what can be discussed in the workplace? And if so, how do you do that? So I'm going to throw that to Tara, because you're in the corporate, you're like major American Express corporate, and you've been at Morgan Stanley and just you have that experience. How do you handle that? Is there a line?
Well, thank you for having me. I will say that this year, the last 12 months, represents a huge change from what I would have said was appropriate or invited in the workplace than it was a year ago. So, for all my experience at Morgan Stanley, let's throw all that in the garbage and let's just start from June of 2020 to today. And one of the things that I think has been really a good outcome from a workplace perspective of the incident, the murder of George Floyd with Christian Cooper, who happened at the same time in Central Park, which touched upon a different and a much more subtle, but more common sense of racism, is that colleagues need to speak and other colleagues need to be educated. And so it's hard to say what the line is, other than saying that we need to make sure that conversations are held within the framework of the values that a company has. So certainly it's not a freedom of speech that you can say anything you want, because as companies, we have expectations on how we should be treating each other. But I do think what we have been able to do is find different ways to create safe spaces for people who want to speak, and then take the time to listen. And I think companies have also been really good at saying it's not the responsibility of the Black people, of the Asian people. We have a lot going on in the Asian community right now, of the women to teach us everything. But rather, we've been really good with hiring companies who can provide a baseline for a conversation. So we're speaking with fact, and then using that to be able to take that to have conversations, whether they're small group, large groups, writing statements on behalf of the company. All that is a huge change from what it had been the last 25, 30 years from when I started.
Yeah,
Jessica, you're nodding. So
yeah, it is. This week, It's been a busy time for me with Bumbershoot, but this week in particular, to your point of writing statements for my clients or providing facts to facilitate conversations. Even I went into a high school and had a conversation and gave them tools on how do you have this conversation. Here are the facts. Always lead with the facts. So that's great that it's applying. So Jessica, you were shaking your head. So now you're in a different space, but how are you managing and how are you advising your clients?
I am in a different space today, but for 20 years, Tara's world was my world. So I was just thinking about how, those of us that are Gen X and boomers, how we kind of came up under a different set of expectations about what we brought to work. I remember orientations, I'm just is kind of giving away my age, but I remember orientations in the 90s, new hire orientations in the 90s, when we would tell people, to leave their personal life at the door. Mm-hmm. And that when they get to work, they can put it down like a suitcase and pick it up on the way back out. And that it horrifies me today but that was how we came up, right? So there was a clear directive, even if it wasn't explicitly stated, that we didn't bring certain things into work with us. And I definitely have seen the evolution of that and a lot more genuine interest in that cliche of bringing one's full self, one's true self to work. And I see companies making genuine efforts to create the space for that, even if they might not be particularly practiced at it. So definitely align with everything that Tara shared. And that's my guidance to clients these days, is that even if you're not particularly practiced at it, even if it's uncomfortable, get the outside support and consulting resources if you need them. But start the conversations, start listening, start showing up, and sit in that uncomfortable place. Show up for your people.
That's really important. Show up for your people. In full transparency, we were going to have a Gen Z member of our little panel this morning. She is a recent college grad and is in the HR space, but she had an interview because I really wanted to understand, because that is the difference. The difference between having luggage and leaving it at the door and just put a backpack on and come into work, like have it with you all the time. So I think that's an important point. So how do you, I guess, when you are bringing the team together in these safe spaces, right, and it's all fact-based, how do you manage if there's someone in the group who goes beyond the facts, right? You don't want to shut someone down. You want to say, this is a safe space. So, we're going to give you the facts, but this is for you to communicate with your peers and colleagues. How do you manage it when it becomes more emotion than fact? I guess that's the easiest way to put it.
Yeah, so I think it's hard to answer that conversation without the full context of the person, the situation. It's kind of, I don't know that there's an easy answer to that. And it's hard because we want to make sure that everyone has a safe space. I go back to, though, we also want to recognize the values of the company and ensuring that we're not putting anyone at harm emotionally or physically, right? And so I think what you have to do is handle them case by case. I think it depends on the context of what they say, depends on, we're working we work within this cancel culture, right? And in some cases, there are people who should be canceled. In other cases, there are people who need to just learn, And so I think that as a leader, you have to moderate that, and you need to figure out how to step in. You need to figure out where to pull someone aside. Sometimes you need for a conversation to happen because it sets itself through the course of the conversation. We actually have a forum that we use on Slack to facilitate conversations about hot topics, actually.
Okay.
But it's moderated. And so we do more polling. So we put a question out there and we'll poll, how do you feel about this or how do you feel about that? But it doesn't actually allow for free form text. So in some way, it
Yeah.
allows a conversation to happen, but it controls the conversation. So I think just when you walk into opening the door, you open a lot. And you have to be thoughtful as you're walking in, what may come out of it. And then you need to, in the moment or even afterwards, when something resonates with someone, figure out how to address it again. But looking at the full context of the statement, looking at the full context of the person, looking at the context of the level of influence that they have, it's multifaceted.
That's great. That's really important, because I know there are leaders who are out there who still haven't had conversations with their teams, right? Because they just don't know how. So that understanding of who the employee is and how they relate to the team, I think that's really a great suggestion. Jessica, have you seen anything on social media that you feel like, wow, this has gone too far, right? Or, because in that space of no longer being in this corporate space, like I'm no longer in corporate America, so I'm always looking at social media just to make sure that I'm informed when I go back to my clients. Are you seeing anything that you think has just gone too far?
So yes, of course, all the time, every day. But I will also say I am not one who spends a ton of time on social media. Now we could debate, whether or not LinkedIn is social media, and I am pretty active there. But even on LinkedIn, I see examples frequently of intolerance. I see examples of blatant racism, sexism, elitism, particularly directed at Black and Brown women who are using their voices to speak up about their experiences. I do see it frequently. And certainly the same types of problematic behavior, racist, sexist behavior that's happening off of social media is happening on social media. So I do see it. And I think there's the same responsibility that we have in our workplace and in our communities. We have to show up in the same way on social media.
So what I have found is that it is definitely generational how much is shared, and what the expectation for a safe space looks like, is available, the frequency, the amount of time. I have some clients where the youngest of the group expect that every meeting opens with a conversation about what's happening socially. How do you manage that? Is that as simple as, thank you for your perspective, and I'm sure that this is very important to you. It's important to me as well. However, let's stay on focus. or like, it's that fine line of keeping people focused, but not treating them like children. But at the same time, understanding that we're in a work environment. And so that should be the number one priority, but we still care about you. Have you run into that? Any pointers around how to manage something like that? It's tough. I know. It's touchy.
And I'm trying to think through, in practical reality, when we're having a conversation that's about marketing or financials, how that might like digress into a conversation about George Floyd. It feels like they kind of have their separate contexts, kind of, sort of. Although I think on a one-on-one basis, when you ask someone how you're doing, if you ask someone how they're doing, they're going to give you an answer. And I think if you're asking someone one-on-one how they're doing, you need to, if you're asking them an authentic question, you need to expect an authentic answer. And so you may need to put your agenda aside to have that conversation, because that's important. But if you're in a meeting, it's 50 people around a board table and we need to talk about the quarterly earnings, that's not the time or place. And I might say, that's a really, that's a topic that I think is important. We need to table that. We need to take that offline, so that someone feels heard, but also so that we're not, kind of missing the point of the meeting. I will say, kind of, you talked about the Gen Yers. I am thankful for them in every generation. I'm thankful for them when they, in the 60s, they led the marches. I'm thankful for them today because they pushed forward. They are pushing us forward. And so you certainly don't want to shut them down, because they reflect a voice of a population, and they will be the change makers. And they have their ear to the ground more than everybody else, us old people. But there's also you have to do your job too. So we can't be out protesting all the time. We have work to do. So there's a balance somewhere in between. But certainly they are the voice that we need in the workplace. They are the ones who will push us forward.
I agree. I just want to help them so that they can articulate their thoughts and also achieve their goals, right? Because that's the balance. And I always feel like I'm in that position because I am an oldie. I am a parent, right? So when they're speaking, I'm like, I think that's such a great point. But let's look at this. So that's great. Jessica, so we are coming up on our time, ladies, because we like to keep these conversations short and to the point. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us a bottom line. What is something that you want to leave our listeners and watchers with that can help them get through this week? I'll start with you, Jessica.
It may be a bit generic, but I talk with clients a lot about learning to listen to one another. I think so often we're concerned about saying the right thing, having the perfect words, knowing exactly what to say in any given moment. And I think there are a lot of people who are early in their journey of anti-racism work, and they don't have the words, they don't have the language, they don't have the comfortability yet, or they have an unrealistic expectation that there's going to be comfortability. And so one of the places I always suggest that folks start is, rather than trying to get all of your words right, show up and listen. Like, show up with your whole heart and full intention to learn, to be uncomfortable, to have your heart and mind opened to something that perhaps has not been a part of your world. And that I find when folks start showing up and listening genuinely, it certainly doesn't solve everything we need to solve at work and in the world, but it's a baby step. It's a starting point in one's learning journey, I would suggest.
Thank you. That's great. Tara?
So I'm going to take from what Jessica said and move it a little bit more forward. And I'm going to say that you have to listen, but action matters. So words are nice, action matters. And so if you want to move a culture forward with inclusivity and equity, you need to take action. And actions come in many different forms. How we hire people, how we promote people. You talked about equal pay, how we pay people. There's a statement that I'm going to steal from someone that said bias moves with speed. And so, because we have a moment, I have leaders watching, if you're making decisions, the best way to ensure that you're going to make a biased decision is to do it quickly and not invite multiple viewpoints. And so if you really want to make sure that you're doing what's right and what you believe to be your values, be slow, be thoughtful, and that will hopefully help to mitigate some of the unconscious, or in some cases conscious, I hope not, right, bias that works through the system.
Okay, and so my bottom line, and I'm going to steal this from Ralph Smithers, who's a friend of mine. it's often, you know, we should all come from a point of curiosity, right? That's my bottom line. As we are going through this process of discovery and moving forward and being intentional and making the changes that are necessary for the future that we want to see, and the future that should have been here now, we have to be curious. You know, Ralph said, oh, you know, always look at someone if they say something that's not quite right and say, I'm curious. Where did you get that information from? Right? So let's be curious. Let's be forever learners, right? And be intentional and listen. So thank you, ladies. Great suggestions, great conversation. And I appreciate you both for your just ongoing support and last minute jump in. So have a great rest of your day. Everyone have a wonderful week. We'll see you next Thursday at 11 o'clock. Take care and be safe.